We come to the sixth presentation in this year-long series, the Parayana, which means the way across. Para is above or beyond. In this sense, it is above and beyond what is known, what is our world. And it actually, in that refined way, it means across. It's the way across, and we are now endeavoring quite magnificently the experience and the vision of the way across. Just yesterday, the Webb for the first time showed from Mars our Curiosity rover taking a photograph of the Martian sunset that had the Earth as a small dot, and if one magnified the pixels, you could see a smaller dot, which was the moon. And so we're able to see ourselves as a very pale star, closer on the planet Terra rather than Earth now. The new nomenclature reflects a planetary understanding rather than a worldly understanding. And Terra and Luna, there are many moons, as a double planet almost, are appreciable for being a part of a star system. And as we talk, one of the great probes going forth is the Far Horizons mission, going all the way out to Pluto, which is the edge of what traditionally was the planetary system. Pluto and its very large moon Charon, which is about a third the size of Pluto. And they are actually now understood to be objects in a vast field called the Kuiper Belt. And just as the asteroid belt punctuates the four smaller planets, the four large gaseous planets have a liminality with the Kuiper Belt, and the asteroid Kuiper Belt objects are much larger, Pluto and Charon being among them, but there are others in the Kuiper Belt that are even larger than Pluto, or of great size. The largest in the asteroid belt is Ceres, and the second largest is Vesta. And our mission, Dawn, has orbited for a year of Vesta, and now is approaching, and a year from now, in the spring of 2015, it will reach Ceres, which is the largest and only dwarf planet. And all of the Webb has been full now in the last week or so of the fact that water vapor is surrounding Ceres, meaning that it has jetted off the surface like water volcanic action. And we are understanding that a great deal of our star system is being seen for the very first time. In fact, Messenger, which was sent and arrived at Mercury, the inmost planet, has only been a couple of 3 years there for the first time, mapping all of Mercury and doing an in-depth study, so that by 2015, approaching 2016, we will for the first time have a reasonable estimate of the size and nature of our solar system, of our star system. In order to facilitate our expansion of our considerations, I have been at work for some 49 years now on the graduate level of universities and teaching. In fact, I began at San Francisco State at the same time that Gemini 4 was launched in June of 1965. And Gemini 4 is extremely important because it's the first time that a human being not orbited the Earth, but stepped outside of the orbiting vehicle and did the first spacewalk, the first EVA, extravehicular activity. And that was Commander Ed White, Lieutenant Colonel Ed White. And in the Gemini 4 capsule with him was James McDivitt. And it's interesting how the synchronicities work. Both of them married women named Patricia. Both of them went to Michigan State, the Spartans in Lansing. Both of them joined the astronaut corps at the very same time, and both of them, when they went into space, were best friends, not only from training and background, but Gemini 4 has a particular mystical quality. When Ed White exited the Gemini 4 capsule, he was scheduled to follow a pre-written plan. And that pre-written plan was jimmied, was not able to be followed because of a communications bug. The communications main switch was not able to function, and so they were going to an alternative switch to get sporadic communication. And it was in this way that there was a serviceable cover-up of something which was mystical. And that is, when Ed White had been out longer than anyone had supposed, and the cover-up story included fiddling with cameras and angles and trying to take photos, especially back on their Gemini 4 capsule, that he did not return in time. In fact, he had to be shouted at to get back in the capsule, both by Capcom, and the Capcom person at that time was Gus Grissom. And both he and McDivitt were yelling at White to get back in. And one of the great photos of White going out is that his hand was raised in such a way that for the first time, someone floating in interplanetary space for all purposes could eclipse the Earth with his hand. And it was exhilarating. I began at San Francisco State in June of 1965. So I've been working on this level for some while. I was the prize teaching assistant and had to take over temporarily, a short term, but nevertheless for the professor I was the TA for. And so I was thrown into teaching all of a sudden at 24. It's interesting to note that by this time, the ability, after almost half a century, not just to offer, quote, courses. I graduated from offering courses to offering a complete, complex, interdisciplinary program by 1970. I was hired to go to Calgary, Alberta, Canada, to do just that, and worked at that for 5 years in Calgary, in Canada, and learned to make the kind of modulations that would allow for sets of resonance to overlap, to interpenetrate, and to begin to create conditions of a harmonic. And the very first two courses that were offered were symbols and world mythology. World mythology, by the way, was the first university course ever taught partly in downtown Calgary at the Indian Friendship Center, not just on campus. And I had pioneered this in San Francisco because when I offered a course on Job and Faust, two faces of evil, I took part of the course off campus to one of the little lagoon-like lakes. San Francisco State is not very far from the coast of the Pacific Ocean, and did excursions out there with my class several times to introduce them to the kind of expanse of concern and consideration that would illuminate the themes of Job and Faust, that the faces of evil have a particular, peculiar quality. They are Janus-faced. They face the past with tremulation, and they face the future with consternation. And there is, in this Janus face of evil, both in its Faustian appeal to thus overcome it, or to eschew it and not give in to it, is the very quality that the high Dharma in wisdom traditions shows, that the face, to give it its Vajrayana way of characterizing, the face of nirvana is exactly the other side of the face of samsara. The enmeshing in the complications of the world into the static and the chaos of impossible extraction, with the complete extraction given all of what has to be raised up and what has to be put down, is now combed through in a way in which that need to raise up as well as the need to put down are both obviated by a horizon of equanimity. It is this zero horizon of equanimity that is able to subsist even though it is invisible to the rhythms of energy, and that energy of which there is a sine wave rhythm is the first dimension of time, as we have talked about. And as time has its crests and troughs, those crests and troughs are always symmetrical, given the way in which the energy is raised, which the time form is speeded up or slowed down, fractionated, and it is this invisible zero horizon of time that is the timelessness of equanimity in terms of resolving the Janus face of being afraid of the past and afraid of the future and desperate to cling to the present moment, which is fragile and precarious because it is always moving, and trying to recompense by imagining that one is going forward in some plan and one is rehashing what has been in some method, and that one is caught between methods and plans, and the actuality of the zero horizon of equanimity, which is the true nature. It's the truth of nature. The truth of nature is that nature as a field is a zero field. Not at all the 0 point energy that is talked about so much in speculation in recent and in current times. A 0 point has vanished. It's the very first statement in Euclid's Pythagorean geometry 2,300 years ago. A locus is a point of no dimension. When it moves, that is the first dimension, and that point describes time, which is a zero horizon, which is dynamic. If one segments that movement it becomes a point that has described a line, and one can develop plane geometry because that line will be able to characterize a plane. And so the beginnings of visualization geometrically are several transforms from a zero field dynamic into a point of zero dimension moving, and that movement now has been characterized by an insertion of making a line, because this line begins here and stops there. And one can connect then the endpoints and begin to make shapes, and one of the first shapes one can make is a triangle. Or one can take a point which has become, by this time, phenomenal or existential in terms of geometry. One can then take a compass and put the pivot on the point and circumscribe a circle so that it is a curved line. And one then has many things that one can do with circles and lines, points, angles, and so forth. What the higher wisdom intends to be appreciated is that that fermentation of the mind makes it clear that space blossoms instantly out of the zero dimension of time, but that time spontaneously occurs and doesn't occur. It both emits and absorbs. It both comes into play, it is out of play. So that there is a quantum fluctuation in the fertile zero field of nature that allows for waves to come from the energy wave of time as a dynamic signature, and that those waves in their positioning, whenever they come back to that zero horizon invisible in the energy, a particle is able to be integraled to form exactly there where the horizon, the invisible zero horizon of time, where the energies of crest and trough are equanimity based, then particality can come into play, phenomenality can come into play. But its play, though it seems when one stays in that realm where one is looking at wave and particle together as the phenomenal universe, that ultimately is an illusion, and concomitantly is a delusion to believe that that is real. It is what it is. It's all that it is. But its reality is that its isness and its isn't-ness have a symmetry to them. In Plato's wonderful dialogue, the Parmenides was a younger contemporary of Pythagoras, from whom geometry developed originally. And one of the qualities of Parmenides was the great philosopher's Zeno-like conundrum. What is, and what isn't, isn't. And they never meet. There is no causality whatsoever between is and isn't. And if one grinds very fine, one can see that they do not meet because their interface is a threshold of a zero horizon that is the very field out of which time itself spontaneously occurs, so that the zero horizon, the emptiness, is fertile. And this is extremely important. One of the traditional wisdom understandings is that wisdom is a different presentation from the understanding of the mind, that the structure of the mind has a masculine tendency to have its formality in such a way that it can be expressed in terms of what is, and to shun the what isn't as if it were something that one doesn't count. In fact, we prorate that in a way since the 3rd century AD in India, and we're able to bring the idea, not zero, in reality, not emptiness, not shunyata, but to bring the idea of zero into counting, so that one then has an ordinal quality from 1 through 9, and then the next number will be 10, which will be a 1 and a 0. And one can use then a decimal scalar and have 1, 10, 100, 1,000, and the zeros then jump the cardinal sequences into an ordinal quality of being able to go. One can also go not just by tens, one can go by ones, cardinality, by twos, you can count by threes, by cubes. There are many ways. In fact, there are a number of calibrations that one can go into ordinality. What's important for us to understand here in the Parayana is that the traditional wisdom is very much a feminine quality of understanding and not a masculine. And that the beginnings, especially when one gets into a refinement like the great way, the Mahayana, being finally in India refined towards the 7th century, the 600s AD, into the Vajrayana. And the beginnings of this are beautifully laid out in a book that was written by Elizabeth English called Vajra Yogini. It's about Vajra is the diamond, it's the jewel, and that Vajrayana is the way in which the jeweled way has at its beginning a quality of femininity. And it is interesting to see that the cult of tantric goddess Vajra Yogini flowered in India between the 10th and 12th centuries of the Common Era at a mature phase of the Buddhist Tantras. By the reckoning of the 10th century, one goes back to the 900s, and the 12th century, one goes to the 1100s. It is in that time period, the zero horizon of the time energy is actually the beginning of the 11th century, or 1000 AD, 1000 CE. And so one learns that, as we have in our learning, because the Learning Civilization program, though it takes as a integral completing pair world mythology and symbols, like I began with in 1970. It also has those interfaced so that myth and symbols is like a process and then a form. It's like a process of experience that comes together in an idea of its meaning. And it is in itself, as a paired phase, myth and symbol, a successor to the earlier paired phase of nature coming into phenomenality, of nature coming into the ritual actions and the ritual objects together making another paired phase of nature and ritual, and then myth and symbol, and those two pairs come together to make a square of attention. Just so in mathematics, if one is dealing with the universe in a very comprehensive mathematical way, and one uses the language of mathematics, the squaring is the quality of space itself, of the way in which to mathematically then express something, like in the equation E equals mc squared. It's the square of light, the velocity of light in a year. It's that square that makes it then able to have the fabric of space, so that it has the time signature that has blossomed already in the squaring to space. But if you put together two squares together, in math, it doesn't make a minimum bit of sense. But the quadratic, as it's called in mathematics, that quadratic is able then to understand that something else has occurred in the integral that mathematically is there, and that is a mathematical understanding, the idea and the language expressing it, that something has occurred, so that when you get a squared plus b squared equals not 2ab squared, but a squared plus b squared is able to have two expressions of the a and b squared, and then also have a 2ab in the emergence in the equality, in the equation. That 2ab that has come into play, has come into mathematical play, has come into the mathematical expression of actuality, is the indication that there is a quotient of interaction that has happened. And that it also, because it is a part of the integral process, acquires particularity that can be seen in the mathematics. So that one then begins to understand that E, being the energy of time, equals mass times the speed of light squared. E equals mc squared. But there is in that play another aspect that needs to be indicated mathematically, that the relativity mathematics that was used by Einstein in the specific theory of relativity in 1905 had to be added to, and so one had the general theory of relativity a little later, that there's something else that comes into play. That something else that comes into play is exactly the quality that comes into play in terms of time and space in the universe. And that particularity in the general theory of relativity is consciousness. which can be given its mathematical expression, but largely like the zero horizon of time in the signature sine waves of energy. It's a zero horizon that can only be there understood as a special ordinality. It allows for a recalibration, for a change, a shift of scalar, and that's what we're doing here constantly in these presentations over now almost a half a century, to comb out what was previously settled for, to get the snarls out, to show that the expansion of dimensions factors more and more into understanding, visioning, theorizing, and going all the way back to recalibrating nature, ritual, myth, symbol, to seeing that vision opens out into more dimensions, and in doing so gives us a closer and closer, not approximation, but arrival at reality. And so the feminine wisdom is actually the teacher of this conscious interplay with the masculine ideation plans, with the masculine way of calibrating. And so the Vajrayana was begun because the understanding that one moved from a thread that one followed, the path integral. Sutra in Sanskrit means thread. It means the path integral. Richard Feynman was one of the masters in the 20th century of how to work the feminine consciousness into the play of mathematics, so that instead of just having the traditional math that already had become proliferated with all kinds of developments, to give a completely new language, the Feynman diagrams. The squiggles and the intersections and the bisections and the coming together and the going apart and the interaction, all of this is like, as Elizabeth English shows in her great volume on Vajrayogini, the beginnings of transforming from the sutra to the tantra, from the sutra of following a masculine thread, even though it is proliferated so that it is many threads that can be woven into a fabric, the fabric of space-time even. When one brings consciousness as the feminine wisdom into play, one then has a tantra, not a sutra, however structured. One of the most important sources for her practice in India is a collection of sadhanas. Sadhanas are the practical ways which can be used to bring you to the threshold, even sometimes seemingly to the brink, and one must then cross over. One must go over the gap where the isn't, and ideation would falter. In fact, it would stop and would do its regressions, or it would do its projections to try to maintain its stability. A sadhana is a meditation and ritual text, literally a means of attainment, that centers upon a chosen deity, in this case upon Vajrayogini, or one of her various manifestations. And one of the very large manifestations later on, almost 500 years later, was Tara. There are white taras, green taras, blue taras. She is the savioress. She is the way in which one can understand that the sutras are important and that they come to a distilling transform into the tantras. When we come back from the break, we'll see that this becomes extremely important. The most powerful early India to Tibet as a sage was Padma Sambhava, and he had two Vajra yoginis. He had Yeshe Tsogyal, it's called Sky Dancer, and he had the Princess Mandarava, and together they understood a way in which there were forms of higher dimension that were possible, but only when a time form had matured in civilization with its complex time forms, that such refinements could be understood. And so those further texts were hidden. They were called termas. And those who were able to find them at the time that they were ripe to be found were called tertans. And all of this comes into play at nodes in the great welter of time forms and civilization, to which we will return after a break in which the pause refreshes.